Hello, I'm Dr. Val Nesset, and on behalf of the Department of Information Science, I am pleased and honored to introduce Denise Agosto, professor in the College of Computing and Informatics at Drexel University, where she also serves as the director of the Masters of Science in Information program. Dr. Agosto's research investigates how young people use information and information technologies and the role of social context in shaping youth's multifaceted information practices. Her most recent work examines misinformation and disinformation in social media. In recognition of the impact of Dr. Agosto's work on the human information behavior research community, she was inducted into the Association for Information Science and Technologies, ASIST, SIG Use Academy of Fellows in 2018. Thank you, Dr. Agosto, for coming to speak to us today on the important topic of parents' perspectives on the benefits and risks of children's digital media use. Dr. Agosto, take it away.
Hi, everybody. And you guys online, can you hear okay? Anybody give a thumbs up?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So my name is Denise. I've known Val a long time. I know Heidi a long time. I'm so happy to be here to speak with you guys because I've read a lot of your work for a long time. It's really influenced me and helped me to learn so much, especially Heidi, Val, and Amy. I've learned so much from you guys, so thank you. I'm happy to be here and to talk about what I love most in the world, which is kids. So we were beaten down, parents' perspectives on benefits and concerns of children's media use.
The next slide.
Yeah. And we were beaten down.
It's probably on your desktop.
There we go. Okay, so I want to talk about a very small part of a much larger project, but I want to give everybody credit because of our larger project. It's an IMLS grant that we finished in September, and I'm still thinking about these data, still reworking them. And I was so happy when Heidi asked me to give this talk because it was the kick that I needed to actually getting putting my ideas down on slides, and I will get them down on digital paper soon. So thank you, Heidi. I needed that kick in the rear. The project is called Navigating Screens, and it ended, as I said, in September with a pretty large team. 3 PIs, Rebecca Willett, University of Wisconsin, me, and June Abbas of University of Oklahoma. And then we had 5 research assistants. Yuan Feng, who at the time was at Drexel and is now on faculty at University of Vermont. Gabrielle Salib, who's at Drexel with me. Nathan Wheeler at Wisconsin, Eric Ely also at Wisconsin, and Anna Hernandez at Oklahoma. That project, which I'm not going to talk about, but I feel compelled to tell you our goals were, and if you're interested, you can read about it online on our website, Navigating Screens at WordPress. But our goals were to understand the sources that parents use and how they learn about how to parent with digital media. To study how librarians and community professionals work in their communities and how they guide parents' use of digital media, and then to create training modules and training tools based on what we learned. And that's all up there on the website. So if that sounds good, well, I'm not going to talk about it. But I do feel compelled to mention it. And next slide. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you guys for paying your taxes, but also IMLS for funding this important work. We simply cannot do the work without the funding. So thank you, IMLS. Now, what I want to talk about is parenting with digital media. And I really struggled in how to talk about this. Digital media we define as any kind of interaction with cell phones, laptops, desktops, iPads, movies, videos, anything that has a screen. But I try not to say the word screen at all, because as soon as I do, all these horrible negative connotations come out. And so I went through all these machinations in trying to work with our site participants not to use the screen, but every single one of them immediately started talking about screens, which is something I want to talk about. And why do we look at parents? Because parents of children, and we're dealing with children ages 5 to 11, are so fundamental in guiding their children's use of media that I think as scholars, as students, as practitioners, and as communities, we have to remember that parents are an important part of understanding children's interaction with digital media. Also, I want to mention, I put little yellow stars around the papers that I think are absolutely fantastic that you absolutely have to read if you're interested in this topic. So they both get yellow stars. Livingstone, in all of her fantastic work, one of her studies, she mentions that education and income are particularly influential in how parents interact with their children around screens. For that reason, we did focus on understanding our research participants' education levels, but we used education as a proxy for income because of all kinds of privacy and IRB issues. So what am I talking about here? This is a subset of a larger project. And in this subset, we conducted, my research assistants and I, interviews with 17 parents in Philadelphia. And we use the term parents, but it's really shorthand for parents and guardians, anybody who has a guiding role in a child's life, anyone who's a primary caregiver. And especially in the areas we're working in, this is very often grandparents or cousins, aunts, uncles, guardians, all kinds of different people. So I want to make sure that you realize parents is shorthand for a larger term of our community of people who take care of kids. 17 interviews with caregivers. They each had to have at least one child aged 5 to 11. Many had kids younger and many had kids older, but they had to have at least one child 5 to 11. We conducted our interviews in English at 3 different branches of the Free Library of Philadelphia. And this particular data analysis I want to talk about today, the part that I've been struggling with how to write and think about, is parents' benefits and concerns related to their children's digital exposure and use. So first, let me tell you a story. This just sticks in my mind. Now, we completed data collection not long before the pandemic. Thank goodness we lucked out in scheduling. And one of the participants, one of the interviews just sticks in my mind, and I've been thinking about this for over 2 years. She, I will call her Mary here. She talked about parenting. She had one child, a daughter, 5 years old. And she and her husband were very much against letting their daughter use any kind of digital media. They said, we both agreed right at the beginning, we're going to have a kid. Screens are bad for children. She said that word for word. She said, our children will not use any screens. By age 5, she was proud that her daughter had never used a computer and didn't know how to work a computer mouse. She felt that this was showing that she had really protected her child. It was a way of protection. As we talked and the interview continued, she later said, well, there are 2 exceptions to our no screen rules. One, when we flew to another continent, we took a long trip, it was like a 25-hour flight. All my friends, all my family told me, you have to let that kid use your iPad or she's going to be a behavioral problem. So we let her use the iPad on the airplane. We let her play some early reading games, and we let her listen to audiobooks. She said it was a mistake. It turns out she would have been fine with paper books, and I regret that. She said then, in addition, for my daughter's 5th birthday, we decided we'd let her watch a movie. We saw Paddington 2. And she said, that was also a mistake. I don't know if you've seen Paddington 2. At one point, Paddington goes to jail. It's a happy, skippy, singing jail, but it's jail nonetheless. A little strange. And she said, this was very upsetting to my daughter. My daughter started to cry, and we regret that. We should not have let her see this movie. Then we continued the interview. The interview went on for maybe 45 minutes. It was over. I turned off the tape. I said, no, thank you so much. I learned so much. She grabbed my arm and she said, I want you to tell me, did I damage my child by letting her see Paddington? And I said, well, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't give a clinical opinion. But as a media scholar and as a mother, heck no, it is okay. You can let your children do some of these things. It's unfortunate that it was upsetting to her, but it's part of our culture. And it's actually probably in the long run a good experience. Guilt. There's just so much guilt. These absolutely fantastic and amazing parents are feeling guilt. And I'm suggesting that a lot of what they're feeding into is just this narrative, this media and especially screens panic digital narrative. Then we have, oh, that was so smooth and it didn't work.
It was, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The keyboard is connected,
use
the
that.
arrow keys on that might do it too.
There we go, I'll use the keyboard.
Now that Tyler, Tyler's a father, yeah, girls in the age range. And the interesting case, he was in Philadelphia just for the summer. He and his wife and their 2 kids, they were staying in Philadelphia. And he was using the libraries, and we were talking about how do you use digital media in your family. And one thing he said was, I'm really happy that we're here in Philadelphia because my kids can't access the TV. We didn't bring our TV with us. And he says, right now we're in a good place. We do like 1 hour screen time a week, so Sundays they can watch or play for an hour. And I'm trying to understand how parents develop these rules. I said, how did you decide what's that? That's what you were gonna go with, Sundays, watch and play for an hour. And he says, well, we were beaten down. And again, we see this real struggle between kids wanting to use digital media and parents taking in this narrative that screens are bad. So we see struggling and we see guilt, and that's what I'm trying to investigate here. Okay, so gotta back up and actually tell you about how we got to this point, how we worked with these people, how we got these data. And this is basically our interview guide. It's much longer, but basically 5 areas. 1, we asked about patterns of family digital media use. 2, family routines with digital devices. My favorite question is always, so can you tell me the story of what you did yesterday? What'd you do from when you got up to when you went to bed? That's where we get a lot of good data because people have something to specifically refer back to and they just tell us the story of their lives. Decision-making related to digital device use, how do you decide what to buy, what to use, so on. Sources of advice, and then at the end, we ask demographics. And we were very careful as a research team to let our participants determine their demographics rather than giving them category choices, because I'm always super uncomfortable with what labels to use. We decided we will ask people, how do you describe your ethnicity? Whatever they get, that's what we'll report, which is great from a social perspective, and really rough from a research perspective, because it makes it hard to compare. Okay. So recruitment and data collection. Eligibility, adults ages 18 to 65, primary caregiving responsibilities of this one child aged 5 to 11, speakers of English. Don't speak any other language well enough to interview in staff. With completely volunteer participation, we recruited at 3 libraries. I went to story times, including drag time, story time, which was my favorite. And also just sitting in the children's department, asking people and handing them flyers. Each person was paid $20 for their volunteering time. And for sampling, I can explain in more detail another day, but we went through from convenience to snowball to propulsive, because it was so hard to get men that we had to really focus on getting men to the study. And every interview ran 35 to 45 minutes. As a team in the 3 areas, the 3 states, we used Deduce because for data analysis, because it's really good for collaboration. We first each, we had a total of 51 interviews in the 3 sites. We picked 2 and we each on our own independently, the 4 lead team members, analyzed them. Then we all flew to Chicago, locked ourselves in a hotel for like 2 days, compared and shared everything we came up with, talked about what we'd learned, created a shared code book, and then we all flew back home and coded all 51 interviews again, and then did the same thing again to change and really meld our individual opinions with our group opinions. And I guess we could kind of call it open coding, but I love this piece by Blair, who talks about, is there such a thing as really open coding? Always the researcher is going to bring perspective. So if you're interested, I just love that. But basically we had a code book that was collaboratively determined by the 4 main members of our research. Next one. From that code book then, I decided to expand upon just 2 of our codes in that larger book. And one was benefits of digital media use, and one was concerns. And the more I read these interviews over and over, the more I became interested in those data. Then I worked with 2 of my research assistants, Emily and Gabrielle, and further expanded upon those particular goals. So trying to keep it in mind is time, I want to talk to you about what we learned. And it's so important to talk to you about who these 17 people were that I got the chance to know. So exciting to get to learn about 17 people's lives. Fantastic experience. Okay, so who were they? Their self-identified roles. Like I said, we had more mothers than fathers. It's harder to get men to participate, and more women tend to take their children to the library than men. Self-identified 10 mothers, 5 fathers, 1 stepmother, although she was also the mother to 5 children and grandmother to 11 children. She had a bunch of children. And 1 young man, 28. He was a father to a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old, and his sister, who's 10 years old, he also had primary care. Education level. Again, remember, we're using education and also job title as a proxy for income because of all the reasons associated with difficulty in collecting income data. We had a pretty good spread of education, just the people who happen to be walking in libraries in Philadelphia, from 2 people who had completed some high school to 5, which is a rather high number of people who had graduate or professional degrees. Probably if you say I'm doing a research project for such and such, more likely that people with graduate and professional degrees feel comfortable engaging and understand how hard it is to get people to take part. So they're also more likely to take part, but there was a pretty good spread here. Self-identified ethnicity, as I said, really good from a social perspective, really hard to compare. 6 people self-identified as African American, 6 as white, 1 is African. She was born in the United States, but her mother was born in one of the countries of Africa, and so she was very proud to be African. 1 woman who said first she was born in Israel, and later that she was Jewish. 1 who was Middle Eastern, later Muslim, she said. 1 Puerto Rican, and 1 who said she was white Hungarian. Of the 17, 15 were born in the United States, 2 were born in other countries. Children by role, fairly even between sons and daughters, but again, and just by coincidence, more girls than boys, and nobody identified their kids as anything other than girl or boy. We didn't have other gender identity. Might well have existed in the sample, but it's not something participants chose to discuss about themselves or their children. And by age, when I was getting fancy, I decided let's do a bar graph instead of the class. Children by age, pretty good spread here, fairly even, 5 up to 11. 24 total children among these 17 parents. In the 5 to 11 range, they actually had 34 total kids who ranged from an 18-month-old to a 21-year-old, but they were outside the areas we're studying. Okay, so what did we learn? What did we come up with? And remember, I'm specifically focusing on benefits and concerns because those are some of the narratives that really interested me in this data. Really kind of talking plain language. Every single parent out of all 17 on their own brought up concerns about children's interaction with digital media. And remember, we never asked them what concerns you. We never asked you what are the benefits. We just asked you routines, what do you do, what do you own? But they felt very compelled in great length to discuss concerns. Only about half mentioned any positive benefits and expectations from digital media. And these narratives were way shorter than the concerns. In fact, we're kind of reaching by saying half of the people mentioned benefits because we're really reading into it. Above all, worries about inappropriate content exposure were absolutely number 1 in the data, over and over and over. Particularly the word inappropriate was used. Also scary and R-rated or even X-rated. These were common words that were used. No one specific benefit dominated the data. Now, remember, we didn't ask about concerns or benefits, and these data were very different had we specifically asked, which means it's important for follow-up work to do some more direct understanding and asking. But these are what people brought up on their own. Okay, sure. I don't know those people, I just think it's Okay, so to try to get through this fast, I really want to emphasize here concerns for two reasons. One, because parents emphasize them. There's very much overweighted data toward the concerns area. And two, it connects better to my discussion that I want to have about moral panics and technical panics. So there are 7 areas of benefits that people mention. Hope you can see these. Communication, especially Skyping or what's the Apple one? Apple
FaceTime.
FaceTiming with grandkids. That was the most common, and people like to talk about that. And that was kind of like an exception from the no screens rule. Well, it's okay if grandma's on the other end. Digital participation, we had 2 men, particularly who worked in the IT field, and they said, I want my kids to have what I have, and they work in IT. And the numbers here. 4 out of 17 parents brought up that communication. So you can see these are really small numbers, but they're important to look at nonetheless. School-related learning, I'm surprised there were fewer. Only 3 parents mentioned that digital talk tools help them with school-related learning. Family relationship maintenance, watching movies together, listening to music before they went to bed. Really, these rituals that bring families close together. 3 people discussed how digital media can facilitate and support those rituals. Entertainment and relaxation. I'm surprised that's not higher. I should think everybody loves to watch a movie, but maybe not Paddington 2. Informal learning, which is just children-directed or parent-directed learning. Just want to learn about something. Trying to think, I think one of the little boys just liked to learn about snakes and had nothing to do with school, it was just self-directed. And occupation, 2 of the parents mentioned, this is something I believe as a parent, sometimes digital media saves my neck. If I need to take a shower, I need something to occupy the little one. I know that's the only reason I'm alive today is because I have videos when my kids were little, but only 2 parents mentioned this, even though it's probably certainly much more common throughout the data. So those are the benefits, but as I said, I really want to focus on the negative stuff. Not that I'm a negative person, but these are much richer, better data, and as a scholar, they're the ones I want to delve into. Okay, so because they're more important, they each get their own screen. Nice. Actually, the benefits had their own screen too, but this morning at 8 o'clock, I realized I'm never going to get through it all, so I just stuck. Okay, so parents' expectations associated with digital media, their concerns, and there are 10 of these. The first, absolutely by far, inappropriate content. 14 of the 17 parents on their own start talking about stuff I don't want my kids to see, inappropriate content and worries. And in each of these slides, I put one example quote from one of our participants. Here's from Eliza. This is a very common expression. It's not appropriate, and my kids know that. And Eliza was really happy because in school, they sent home photocopied sheets and they had lessons about what's appropriate and what's not inappropriate, just specifically for the kids. Oh, and obviously these are pseudonyms. At time, 12 of 17 parents were really repeating this narrative of limit screen time, limit screen time, limit screen time. And the phrase screen time came up in all 12 of these. Parents are worried about that the number of minutes their kids are involved in digital media each day. And here's Jordan, who says, when I wake up, I just take that stuff away from the kid. And what's important here, and I put in bold, is it's a battle. So often these parents were framing this as a battle or a struggle. Really, parents doing what they think is right and what they're told is right from the media narrative and battling it out with their kids, which just can't be good for them. He also had an older son and younger son. Okay, next. Monitoring, worries about how to monitor what kids are doing online when parents aren't there. This was a very common refrain. And here's Harold. He had responsibility for raising his sister as well as his 2 kids. Okay. Safety, reputation, and privacy. Now, in the code book that we started out with all 4 researchers, these are all separate, but I actually collapsed them all because there wasn't enough data really to justify separate categories in the data from Philadelphia. They're all one. And here's Yvonne, really, really interesting. And she's saying, whatever out there on social media can come back to haunt you. And this is a narrative we saw over and over and over. It wasn't like that when we were kids. I love, she says, nobody knew what you did on spring break. Now people do. Of course, I wanted to ask her what she did on spring break, but. Next.
Sorry, that's the next one.
Oh, that is?
Sorry.
Oh, I knew that. Okay, displacement, and this idea that pretty much anything else than using digital media is better for kids. Get kids reading books, and remember, we're in a public library, so just naturally the people who are coming in are probably going to be very in favor of physical book reading, but very much, I don't want my kids on media, I want them holding a paper book, or I don't want my kids on media, I want them outside. And I just loved this example. She had a 21-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter. She was a teenage parent with a 21-year-old, and she said the public library is where she took her son over and over and over to get him experiences they couldn't have in the city. You can't have online. I've never met a pop up. Oh, inappropriate behavior and mood. Only 5 out of 17, only about a third of parents mentioned this. Inappropriate behaviors. There's really just Zara who's worried about physically acting out in kids. She was really worried about keeping kids from watching TV because she felt that they would become physically violent. But most of the 5 were worried about mood. They said the kid is grumpy, unhappy, and non-participatory on digital media. I want them off media so I can keep them having good moods and good behavior. Oh, social skills. This was a really interesting one. Several of the parents, in fact 5 of 17, said that digital media are destroying their kids' social skills. They can no longer have conversations. They don't know how to interact. They don't know how to behave. And it'd be really interesting to talk about this now in light of 2 years of the pandemic. This is prior to the pandemic. But Tyler says, I have a lot of concerns. His words, not mine. But one is kids losing the ability just to socialize, which is interesting to me because he's bifurcating physical socializing from digital socializing, and I would suggest that they're all elements of socializing. But wait, I'm not supposed to do the interpretation, just findings right now, so scratch that. School performance, 4 out of 17 parents were worried that their kids would spend too much time online and it would detract from schoolwork. Dependence, we use the word dependence, but parents tend to use the word addiction. They talked about addiction. Greta, who's not listed here, who had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, she said her husband is addicted to the phone and it's a particular problem in their family. And she said, oh, he's terrible. He brings his phone to the table and my 2-year-old will say, no phone's at the table, Daddy. Talk about, but it's this narrative of addiction to digital media, and particularly role modeling. And lastly, physical development. 2 people mentioned worries about physical development. Particularly Jordan was worried about eyesight and worried about carpal tunnel and really worried about how using screens a lot or digital media a lot was going to damage his kid physically. Okay, so those are the 10 concerns that we came up with. And remember, what's interesting here is we didn't ask about concerns. So, 10, 15 minutes, let's delve into them a little more deeply and let's consider, what do these concerns mean? What do they represent? What do they represent from a media perspective? Well, this one gets a star, of course. Livingston and Palmer's discussion of 4 risk factors, saying that the 4 major risk factors that adolescents and children face online are contact, so association with those creepy older people. I hear that a lot when I work with teenagers. Didn't hear that much working with the younger group. Content, inappropriate content, that we heard so much. Conduct, a little bit worried about children's mood, behavior, and conduct. Intriguingly, commercialism. Of the 17 people, only 1 mentioned she was worried about commercialism. It was Marla, who was worried about particularly Barbie, and she said, Barbie doesn't have a profession. Being a princess is not a job. And she's very worried about marketing Barbie and other products, but just 1%. And within our 4 data, you see it's pretty smart, I rearranged those to represent order of importance within our data and how much they came up. Content, absolutely content. Contact a little bit, contact a little less, and commercialism, just the 1%. But still, I think our data do a good job of supporting from a different perspective. So Livingstone and Palmer are looking more from a children's perspective, analyzing children's behaviors, and we're seeing support of those same concepts from the parental perspective. So here's what I really want to talk about. Panicking. And those of you who are media scholars probably know that Cohen in 1972 wrote a very influential book on suggesting the concept of the moral panic, not the media panic, the moral panic. And Cohen was looking at young adults and their deviant behaviors, as he called them. And he suggested that the media at the time, mostly newspapers and television especially, really over-reported deviant youth behaviors. And in doing so, it gave off the impression that all kids were engaged, all young people, young adults were engaged in deviant behaviors rather than the select few. And it added to this moral panic and this otherness and distancing from adults and young adults, saying young adults are deviant and stigmatizing youth. We now have almost 50 years of research building on Cohen's work. It's a very, very, very rich literature. And starting around the turn of the millennium, 2001, people started saying, well, let's consider applying these concepts of the moral panic and the mass media to the internet. There's an interesting paper here, we didn't get a star, I guess, by Baker, who looked at Usenet in the very, very late 90s. And he suggested, yeah, let's move on and look at the internet. It's really a right source of investigation of new forms of this moral panic. And we can think about how the concept of the moral panic is moving into internet-based worlds. We also see from many researchers, but perhaps most notably Boyd here, that the mass media tend to really over-represent risky behaviors, particularly adolescents who have met with adults in relationships that started online. And in Boyd's 2014 book, she traces 2 or 3 cases, and she shows how they spread across the country and how those same cases were repeated, refed, and reused in the media to exaggerate the risk here. And interestingly, Clark, in working with parents, says as soon as you mention online risk to parents, they immediately start thinking of cyberbullying and sexual predators, which is interesting. We didn't get much of that data, but remember, we never mentioned risk. We didn't mention concern, we just asked people to talk. So these are some of the important ideas that are rolling around in my head for 2 years as I'm trying to figure out what I want to say. And the most important paper, and I just love this paper, is Alice Marwick's 2008 piece on technopanics. Really fantastic piece. And she talks about MySpace, which makes us giggle now because the only thing we think of as MySpace is Tom. But at the time, MySpace was really quite active, and especially among teenagers. And Alice Marwick says, I don't think what we really have here is a moral panic. We have a new kind of a panic, and I'm going to call it a techno-panic. She said there are 3 characteristics that really determine the techno-panic. First, they focus on new media forms. And she said, that happened when there was the telephone. It happened when, what's new media from the 70s?
Comic book.
What is it?
Comic book?
The comic book. She talks about the comic book.
8-track tapes.
8-track tapes. Now you're getting it. And she said each time there's this new medium, these sort of techno-panics tend to happen. She also said these techno-panics pathologize young people's use of the media. So comic books, it was really characterized as this deviant behavior, reading a comic book. And thirdly, she said, all this media panic is not just in the media, though. It turns into widespread anxiety among the general populace. And the populace responds by trying to modify or regulate young people's behavior. The adults want to sweep in and scream about screen time. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's no danger and there's no risk to using digital media. I'm saying it's largely exploded. It's much bigger than it should. And I was trying to figure this out. I changed the slide like 15 times. So really the idea of the media panic until social media was really quite popular has moved now to, I would say, just more of the parental zeitgeist. The idea that you are supposed to protect your kids from media is now something that we just accept as a society, I think, and my parents in the study center. But that's me, not us. So what's this difference between the concept of the media panic and using the media? And is a techno panic just the same thing as a media panic? It's actually a little bit different. And I think Mara was really picking up on this. And Walsh recently said, panic now has changed. It used to be largely inflated in the mass media, TV, a newspaper most particularly. But now we have become the replacement of the mass media in social media. And so we are doing the panicking and we're doing the inflating and the sharing of these stories. So two main changes: one, the late participation, and two, the manipulating of public communications. So more so than the media determining the public narrative, we are. Okay, 8 minutes or less, conclusions. So reframing the techno-panic narrative. This is really something important. A recent paper, we were meant to put a star in it, that I quite like, with older kids, talking about adolescence and sexting. And the conclusion here of Razi and her colleagues is risk narratives are not constructive. Talking about risk really doesn't help anything. Instead, we want to accept that these behaviors are part of life, and we want to talk about management and how to live with these different types of behaviors. And I think that's a really important comment. We shift from a narrative of risk to management and balance. Let's see. And with this work, we want to broaden this discussion beyond risks and point out that parents are genuinely concerned about their impacts on children and their well-being. We try to understand the parent's perspective as scholars. And then this is something I've been saying for over 20 years. For this reason, we want to favor education over restriction. We want to teach kids how to live with these media rather than just keeping them off. But in the long term, that does much more service. And we want to understand digital media use is a part of most children's lives. That said, we also want to absolutely respect parents' decisions and determining how much they want digital media to be a part of their lives. This work further suggests that we as scholars, as professionals, and just as people should try to change this negative narrative, emphasize balance between benefit and concern. I would argue there are a heck of a lot more benefits here than these parents are seeing because they're just not privy to the benefits narrative. And also, not time today, but I wanted to make sure to point this out, focusing on these families, these diverse kind of families, and profiling individual families and people really gives us more power as a platform to discuss issues of diversity, power, and privilege. And we should use them as a guiding framework for understanding these communities. And I'm working on that another day. That one's way easier to write. And parent and guardian influence is key, as we saw in Clark's work, to understanding children's information behavior practices. So for those of us who work in the field of information behavior, when we study youth, we want to also study families and understand behaviors in familial and social contexts. And last slide. We want to try to reduce parental worry, conflict, and guilt. There's just so much of it out there. And parental worries are crucial, and they're important, and they're legitimate. There is scary stuff online, but we want to try to reduce this zeitgeist and this worry, and also hopefully help reduce some of that conflict in families. Just take pressure off of people from the no screens or limit screens narrative and accept more that this is natural behavior. As such, as educators, scholars, practitioners, we can help parents feel better about their choices, but within the realities of digital media. Oh, phew, I have no idea how long that would run, but
That's perfect. Thank you, Denise, for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And I'm going to open up the floor for questions, but I have to ask one first. And maybe it's more of a comment than a question. I'd like your thoughts. Thinking about the 4 C's, the content push. I am wondering if the techno panic is not exacerbated by the commercialism, and I think right back to clickbait. You know, let's over-report, let's sensationalize so we can sell more media. And I wondered if what your thoughts on that if there's a direct link there.
I would argue there certainly is, that providers of content need those clicks for advertising dollars. And we're just much more likely to click on something that's entertaining, that's emotional, that's a little edgy than we are boring, dry fact. And for that reason, most content providers, in essence, are much rewarded for exaggeration, not really rewarded for reporting strict truth. And that goes back, I think, to a lot of the work that we're doing in misinformation, disinformation, and I would say, yes, Val, yes.
Thank you. Sam.
Thank you, Denise. That was excellent talk, very interesting. So first, I'll just say Paddington 2 is objectively an excellent, incredible movie. It's also empirically a incredible movie in that it's like one of the most highly rated movies among critics in the world. Like really, like we're talking Citizen Kane level.
It really,
like,
really,
it really is.
Metacritic calls it a must see.
Yeah. I'm curious about how much your findings are related to the population or the sample that you had, right? You mentioned somewhat, right? You know, these are people coming to a library, right? And so, and so there is, all your findings make sense, but I keep thinking about, right, the fact that there is either anecdotally, we will see children in front of screens all the time, particularly in public settings. And then on top of it, right, like you can look at the data behind, like, let's say games, children's games, right, which are Roblox, for example, which is one of the most profitable game companies now in the world, publicly traded, right? And that's a game, for those that aren't familiar, it's a game platform that's designed for children, right? And they're raking in money. So I mean, that's kind of, you know, at least indirectly, a good example of just how much time kids are spending in front of screens. So I'm curious, right? So it almost seems like there's a dichotomy here, right? There are the people who are afraid of Paddington 2, and then the people who are, I'm giving my child money to spend on digital media.
Absolutely. The question about how much is related to the population, I would say a heck of a lot. And for that reason, I tend to think of people more as individuals and family cases, as opposed to, certainly I would never generalize, but as opposed to saying that this is how the situation is. These are individuals. And one thing I can say, we did notice that parents giving kids money, overall in the Philadelphia data, we had this bifurcation largely between people who were less educated and of lower socioeconomic groups, and those who were very overeducated and very in high socioeconomic groups. We saw this conflict that those in the higher socioeconomic groups were the most likely to be worried about the screen narrative, and they were the most likely to envision digital media as something to protect their kids from and to keep their kids off, because they were taking in this public narrative that's dangerous. For those in the lower economic groups, were the most likely to encourage their kids to go out and to use digital media. And a couple of them specifically said, it's because I want my kids to catch up with the other kids. We don't have these connections. We can't buy these devices, so I want them to use them. So does that answer your question? Doesn't answer the library situation, but I did see this real difference in perspective among socioeconomic.
I guess then maybe as a follow-up, is that, do you think that alters or suggests changes in some of the conclusions, right? Where you're talking about like, well, let's educate, let's educate, for example, right? So you have like the benefits to children, right, and to parents, but then that's seeming like, well, that seems like that would only work for a segment of the population, and another population, do they even need? If you're using screens a lot, then do you even need this kind of education, or is it a different type of education, or is this a suggestion that maybe there'd be a concern? I'm just curious, maybe more of like, how do you think about this like generalizably?
Well, I don't, because this is very naturalistic work. It is not generalizable, and it's not intended to be. That just doesn't make sense in this context. But I can say that education, I think we might be looking at it differently. In education, I'm thinking of the broader education, and some of that education is that video games 12 hours a day is not healthy. So I'm not necessarily saying educate in order to increase digital media use and access. I'm saying educate to understand nuance and more of the broader implications of digital.
Do we have any questions from
Nothing online, yeah.
Jin Chao, and then I think we'll have to stop.
Yeah, Denise, this is such a timely topic for me personally. I have a kid, in this age range, and sometimes, we got into discussion about, about this. So I got a couple of questions for you. The first one is, have you thought about interviewing kids? Not just the parents, could be they're together, listen to their conversation, what's their rationale of, why, the kid wants to be on the screen, why the parents, do not. I mean, how they actually go back and forth, to have hopefully a better solution. So that's the first question. The second question is about, policy regulations. I mean, especially, like the inappropriate content, that exposure to such content, that can be a huge problem. What I mean by that question is that, do you think the current, regulations, laws, policies are sufficient, enough to prevent kids, from exposing to the content? If not, is that an area that you think you might be looking at, or somebody else, should look at?
Sure. So the first one, it's nice. But the first question, do we want to work with kids? Yes. Why did we not work with kids here? A couple reasons. One, because we wanted this parent's perspective. Two, because of the IRB nightmare.
Yeah.
There's so much of reality here in research. It is so hard for us to get contact with the kids that this was seen more as an initial step. Ideally, we're going to work with the kids and parents together. As it was, to get through IRB, it took us almost a year here. And it's a 3-year funded project, realities, but you bet we need more kids' perspectives. And there is a fair amount of that in the research, we never have too much. And secondly, as for policy and regulation, I would say we don't have very effective policy. We have in fact very limited policy. And what we've really done is cede the responsibility for determining content to the policy providers. The content providers who are not doing a great job. Very often they promote themselves as conducting scraping of misinformation, fake news, deleterious content, or YouTube protections for children, but it's very badly done. A lot of that is because we don't have in the United States effective related policy. But I wouldn't put the entire responsibility on policy. I would say the only answer is a multifaceted approach. We need stronger policy. We need much better education in schools. We need public education. We need a heck of a lot of money to support all this. All these different elements need to come together to improve the media environment. And as much as I'm saying that I think parents' concerns are excessive, I'm not saying I don't think there's dangerous content online, and in fact stuff that shouldn't be there.
think we're a little over time, but we had that earlier technical difficulty. So I'd like to say thank you again, Denise, for visiting us. Reading the work that's going to come out of this. And thank you to our audience, and we look forward to you attending our next research seminar. So thanks again.